For Telesur, I'm Cody Weddle in Caracas, Venezuela. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us today. This is From the South. To begin, former Guatemalan President Perez Molina has spent his first night in jail. This after he was ordered to prison for a provisional term as he awaits trial on the corruption charges against him. Now, the order came a few hours after resigning as president and after the Constitutional Court had denied his attempts to block the lifting of his immunity. This is a dramatic change in the politics of Guatemala, a country that could have never have imagined a president resigning over corruption, much less ending up in prison. Now, Judge Miguel Angel Gavez said that Perez Molina posed a flight risk and should be held at the Matamoros military prison near the center of Guatemala City.
I respect what the judge said, but I do not have the least intention to leave the country or to flee. I am showing my face. I will keep doing it. I will do what is necessary.
And shortly after being sworn in as the caretaker president of Guatemala, Alejandro Maldonado asked all his cabinet ministers and top government officials to hand in their resignations. Now, Maldonado said he would form a new government to leave a legacy of honesty and restore faith in democracy there. He then addressed youth and other Guatemalans who have been protesting since April. He called on them to continue their fight for democracy and against corruption.
I have given my faith to the Constitution, and from that I assume not just this solemn institutional commitment, but also a coherent vote that joined me with the ideals of the Guatemalan nation.
And we go to Venezuela now. That's where the government has opened the border crossing in the state of Táchira for students. Now, the authorities are allowing at least 1,500 Colombian students to cross from Ureña in Venezuela to Santander in Colombia throughout the day. The move contradicts Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos, who earlier said that the Venezuelan government was preventing the students from entering Colombia. And Juan Manuel Santos, the president there in Colombia, has announced he is ready to meet his counterpart Maduro to try to settle the border situation, but with some conditions. Now, one is the creation of what he calls a humanitarian corridor to allow Colombian children who live in Venezuela to go to school in Colombia, as we just reported. Another one is for 15 trucks to be allowed into Venezuela so that the 1,300 Colombians repatriated can recover their belongings. And we're going to go back now to Guatemala, our top story. We go to Gerardo Torres, who is in Guatemala covering the latest there with the president after his resignation. Gerardo, thanks for joining us there. What's the latest you can tell us following the president's resignation?
Well, hello, Cody. Yesterday, former President Perez Molina left in a prison that is was really a military installation, but he was sentenced to a prevention prison because his trial has already begun. He presented his resignation early yesterday to the National Congress, and he presented himself to the tribunal for accusations of three main things. The first is participation in a corruption scandal. Second is his knowing and his permission of corruption cases, and third is a bad behavior of public officials. These three cases demand jail, and as for Rosana Valdetti, the former vice president. Also, yesterday, the vice president Alejandro Maldonado, who is a former judge in Guatemala, assumed as the new president of Guatemala and will be the president until January 13th, when he will give power to the winner of this next Sunday's election.
And Gerardo, as we reported there, the new president Maldonado has asked all of the existing ministers there to resign. Why is that?
Excuse me?
That the new president there, Maldonado, who has assumed the presidency, he has asked the ministers, the existing ministers, to resign. Why has he asked them to resign?
Well, Maldonado is in a transition government. He knows that his main responsibility is to guarantee the elections and to guarantee the beginning of a new government. What he is demanding is that all the ministers that were part of Otto Perez Molina will present to the tribunals if they are called. And what he wants to do probably is to create a new cabinet that doesn't attract any of the attention of the protesters or the citizen movement that are still claiming for more corrupt public officials to be sent to tribunals and for more people that were part of the corruption scandal for Molina to be put in jail.
And this Sunday elections, they're advancing quickly. What can we expect and how are preparations going there for Sunday's elections amidst this political crisis?
Well, the resignation of President Perez Molina and he being sent to tribunals and he also being sent to prevention prison has made it a more favorable environment for the elections of next Sunday. The people are celebrating the resignation of the president, and what the government is doing right now and what the authorities are trying to do is to lower the people that don't want to go to vote. They are calling people to vote. As we have been saying, the indignado of the outrage movement in Guatemala have said in many occasions that they don't feel represented by the political parties that are participating. The expectation is that the conservative leader party that has Manuel Valdizón as candidate will win the presidential elections, but that the municipalities and the deputies for the National Congress will be a very tight race. There is not much difference between the candidates. We're talking about 3 or 4 points in difference. That could change in the next stage, but still, it's more probably that the leader party will win the presidency and there will be a government made of 3 or 4 parties in almost equal conditions for our next administration.
All right, Gerardo Torres with the latest out of Guatemala. Gerardo, thank you.
Thank you.
And elsewhere we go to South America now, to Colombia, where some 5,000 rural residents who make up the so-called Agrarian Summit continue to mobilize, demanding from the government better conditions for development in the countryside.
Indigenous Afro-descendants and campesinos took to the streets of Bogotá to protest land concentration and the lack of support for agriculture. In the wake of peaceful mobilizations taking place this week, the protesters have been stigmatized, and indigenous people have been accused of being violent for carrying what the government deems as potentially dangerous sticks.
For us indigenous, this is a symbol of authority that is extremely significant. That's why we have to carry it all the time with us. That's what orients us and gives us strength, intelligence, and wisdom.
The systematic criminalization is precisely one of the most pressing issues for rural residents. Among their demands are proper land distribution and technical support and farming, also respect and guarantees for their leaders, movements, and social protests.
Here in Colombia, the state has always been dedicated to criminalize, accuse, and neglect the social, and that has been used as a practice to invisibilize the state responsibility in the decline that this country is experiencing.
For social movements and rural leaders, the recognition of their demands and struggles appears as a key issue, especially as the country is attempting to construct peace and reconciliation after more than 50 years of internal war.
If there's no respect for the different, and we don't realize that this country is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, with a high regional diversity and consequently with different needs and demands, then the armed conflict might come to an end, but the social conflict will remain, and people will always continue to struggle for their rights.
Right here in the Ministry of Agriculture, representatives of the Agrarian Summit continue to hold negotiations with the minister, hoping that this time the government will comply with agreements. Among those agreements are the guarantees for social protest. Natalia Margarita, Telesur, Bogotá, Colombia.
The Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has arrived in Qatar for talks on supporting international oil prices. Now, Maduro was met by Qatari authorities at the airport in Doha and was expected to meet the emir, bin Hamad Al Thani. The visit comes as the Venezuelan leader was returning from China and is part of an effort among OPEC members and other oil producers to defend the price of crude on the international markets. The Foreign Minister of Chile, Gerardo Munoz, has started an official visit to Cuba to increase bilateral ties between the two countries. He was welcomed by his Cuban counterpart, Bruno Rodriguez, and was accompanied by a delegation of representatives from 35 companies and trade unions. The visit comes 45 years after late President Salvador Allende took the first international step to break the isolation of the island, causing the wrath of Washington. We move now to Argentina. That's where the country scored another partial victory against the holdout creditors known as those vulture funds, which failed to seize the country's central bank assets in New York. From Buenos Aires now, our correspondent Laureano Ponce with those details.
Has just scored a new victory in its legal battle against the vulture funds. A federal appeals court in New York has determined that Argentina's central bank assets in that city cannot be seized, rejecting a demand by the hedge funds to do so. This ruling corrects a previous one by Judge Thomas Grissa that favored such request, violating foreign sovereign immunity, which is recognized by U.S. legislation.
This ruling protects the central bank reserves and its account in the U.S., in Wall Street. That allows Argentina to have a safe place in Wall Street to operate, to make financial operations that it could not carry on until now.
In response to this new decision, Paul Singer's NML Capital, which is considered the main actor among the vulture funds, issued a press release saying that Argentina defies the U.S. judicial system and calling the country an international scofflaw and demanded full payment on their bonds. However, experts agreed that the rejection of the vulture funds request was based on the risk it could have represented for the American financial system.
All central banks in the world have an account in the U.S., the Chinese, the Germans, every country. If those accounts were able to be seized, many countries would take their money to some place where they would not be seized.
Argentine government officials have also pointed out that these partial victories reinforce the country's position of reaching an agreement with the holdout creditors, but under fair payment conditions.
Argentina is paying everybody, but we are in a situation in which the president, with a firm and clear vision established, will not pay all the expense of letting someone steal the Argentine people's money.
Argentine experts have also started to question what they understand is a lack of independence by Judge Thomas Grissa, as this is the second of his pro-vulture funds rulings that the appeals court has modified in only 1 month. Laureano Ponce, Telesur, Buenos Aires.
The indigenous communities affected by the oil pollution left by the oil giant Chevron in Ecuador have been granted the right to target the company's assets in Canada. Now, this is in order to recover a $9.5 billion compensation award. The Canadian Supreme Court has ruled today against the oil giant in a historic decision that gives hope to environmental victims across the world. A ruling in 2011 ordered Chevron in Texaco to pay $19 billion to the Ecuadorian villagers affected by its pollution in the Amazon, an amount that was later halved. The Ecuadorians have since been seeking to collect the money in several countries, but they were barred from any action in the United States in 2014. The company had claimed that the Ontario court that first heard the case in Canada and who unanimously ruled in favor of the villagers had no jurisdiction. And to discuss that ruling now, we're going to turn to Santiago Escobar in Toronto, Canada. He is the coordinator of the anti-Chevron campaign there in Canada. Hello, Santiago, and first let me just congratulate you on that ruling. I'm wondering if you can explain the case for us, sort of wrap up that case. What were the Ecuadorian indigenous communities there demanding?
Of course, yeah, it's basically we are happy, we're full of energy, of hope, because now it's proved that big players and big corporations can defeat it too. So basically, as you have said, after 3 decades of oil exploitation, Texaco Chevron dumped about 18 billion gallons of wastewater in the rivers, destroying wildlife and negatively affecting homegrown agriculture. This has led to high cancer rates and birth defects among the local population, or what we know as the Amazonian Chernobyl. So basically, on December 2013, the Ontario Court of Appeal ruled that Ecuadorian indigenous communities have the right to pursue Chevron assets in Canada. And Chevron appealed the sorry?
Go ahead.
Chevron appealed the decision, to the Supreme Court, arguing that Chevron U.S. is different than Chevron Canada. So basically, this is the main issue at the Supreme Court, because Chevron was already found guilty in Ecuador. So this is about seizing Chevron assets in Canada.
And to what extent does that sentence today go beyond that sentence and have implications for human rights victims worldwide, since it can be really, to what extent can it be a push for other victims elsewhere to pursue their rights against these huge companies?
Yeah, this ruling shows that the most vulnerable, the poor, the voiceless, ordinary people also have rights. They also exist, and finally they can get justice. This is a huge precedent, especially here in Canada, because communities across the world are resisting Canadian corporations, mining corporations. So, and in order to demand accountability. So this ruling also gives us energy and hope. Basically, like I said, corporations can be defeated too. So here in Canada, this will change the whole picture and will open the path to finally make corporations accountable here in Canada. As you have known, most of the big mining corporations have their headquarters here in Toronto.
And these big companies, they really have a lot of tricks up their sleeves. The oil giant there tried to hide its assets in overseas subsidiaries, sort of as a way to evade paying civil judgments in environmental cases. That's something multinational companies do often. Do you think this ruling here can help stop those little tricks that they use?
Yeah, we know Chevron's dirty tricks. We know corporations' dirty tricks. So unfortunately, these dirty tricks have been emulated by all corporations in order to avoid liability. So I think, like I said already, this opens a big window to finally make those corporations accountable. And I think now the environmental movement, the social justice movement here in Canada will use this ruling as a precedent, because in the past, many communities, especially from Central America, have sued mining corporations here in Canada, and they didn't get any justice. So this is, is a big victory, like I said, for the indigenous communities, for the voiceless people, and we are so happy to have this news.
And quickly here, this sentence, it really only allows the victims to move ahead with their demands over Chevron assets in Canada, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have won this case for good. What can we expect here, and what do you think will eventually happen here?
The affected ones will continue the legal process. So basically, that means that the ruling from the Supreme Court has to get back to the Ontario Superior Court in order to enforce the ruling. So that means seizing Chevron assets. So we will see, as you might know, Chevron will use all the legal and illegal means to avoid to get accountability. So basically, they have all the money in the world. They have an army of about 1,000 lawyers. So they will use all legal and illegal means to stop the affected ones by seizing their assets here in Canada. But social movement, civil society, we will be also putting some pressure on Chevron, and we will be mobilizing our communities, and we will also demanding that Chevron finally pay what they own, and clean up their mess they left behind in Ecuador.
Well, we will continue to keep an eye on it here. All right, Santiago Escobar joining us from Toronto, Canada. Mr. Escobar, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we look around the world now. We go again to the refugee crisis in Europe. The interior ministers of Austria, Hungary, Serbia, and Macedonia have signed a memorandum of understanding to identify and implement measures to cope with the huge influx of refugees in a coordinated manner. Now, the meeting took place in Macedonia, where some 4,000 refugees were reported to have arrived at the border in the last 24 hours. The Serbian Interior Minister said that the ministers were working to find a common solution, but made a thinly veiled criticism of Hungary's newly erected fence on their border. Now, he added that his country is ready to discuss taking in a quota of migrants, sharing the burden with the European Union that it wants to join.
Of course, we are trying to find a common solution, and I think this was one of the goals of this conference. Of course, we don't think that building walls will stop people.
The European Commission now has proposed to its fellow commissioners to increase the number of refugees that might be relocated to a total of 160,000. National governments rejected in June a proposal by Juncker that they take in 40,000 asylum seekers from Italy and Greece. This new proposal will be part of a package of measures to be presented to the European Parliament next Wednesday. The United Nations Refugee Agency has expressed its extreme concern about the recent comments made by the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban that the country would not accept Muslim refugees. Now, Orban said on Thursday that a history of Ottoman rule in Hungary meant that the people were opposed to Muslim immigration, a point previously made by neighboring Slovakia. The UNHCR spokeswoman reminded that the 1951 Refugee Convention is non-discriminatory and that anyone fleeing war or persecution has the right to protection. Meanwhile, a second ship with 2,500 refugees has arrived at Piraeus port in Athens from Lesbos in just over 12 hours. This as the situation in the Aegean island turns volatile due to the influx of refugees. Greece said on Thursday that it will ask the European Union for about 700 million euros to build infrastructure to shelter the hundreds of refugees and migrants arriving on its shores daily. Four suspected human smugglers who were detained in connection with the deaths of Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi and his family have appeared in court in Turkey. Mothers of the suspects were present outside the court, but denied their son's involvement in human smuggling. Alan and his family were buried in their hometown of Kobani near the Turkish border. Gaza fishers keep being attacked by Israeli forces while they try to earn their living. A child was injured this morning in one of those attacks. More now from Noor Herzine. It appears we have some problems there with Noor's report. We're going to move on now. Finance leaders across the world will meet this weekend to discuss global stock markets and communities as it pertains to China's slowing economy. Although this had been in the forecast, the cross-border repercussions are greater than anticipated. Now, the International Monetary Fund warned in a report that the expected boost in economic activity from lower oil prices has not materialized, and weakening international commodity prices and stock prices will be experienced. A double suicide bombing killed 19 people and wounded over 140 on Thursday in northern Cameroon, where soldiers are battling Boko Haram fighters from Nigeria. Now, one of the blasts hit a camp housing infantry fighting the Islamists, while another was at a market. The attacks were reportedly carried out by female suicide bombers. A medical scare in Eastern Europe to report now as 2 children in southwestern Ukraine have been paralyzed by polio. Authorities say this is the first outbreak of the disease in Europe since 2010. Now, they added that the risk of further spread of the disease is high, placing all children in Ukraine at risk. There is no cure for polio, which attacks the nervous system and can cause irreversible paralysis within hours of infection. However, one can be vaccinated against being infected. The disease mainly attacks young children in areas with poor sanitation. On the other side now, Liberia has been once again declared free of Ebola. Thousands of Liberians died at the height of the epidemic last year. The World Health Organization had declared the country Ebola-free in May, only to see the fever resurface 6 weeks later. This new announcement prompted muted celebrations in the capital, Monrovia. A new Mexican animation film has hit cinemas in the United States. It's about a chicken who tries to save his family from an evil rancher with dubious intentions. Now, the producers of the new film expressed pride in the film, which garnered some great reviews and success in Mexico. They say the film was a challenge to create, as it is always difficult to mesh the characteristic of an animated character with the human being voicing it. However, producers say the film was a hit in Mexico with both young and older audiences.
Sí pelearé. ¿Es cierto que usted va a salvar el rancho? Ah, sí.
Now, to take a look at this amazing footage here, these are killer whales, or orcas as they're known, and they were filmed by Russian cameraman Mikhail Korostelev, who has been documenting the mammals as part of a project investigating the behavior of orcas and other marine life under the auspices of the Kamchatka Institute of Ecology and Nature. Now, the project hopes to better understand these majestic creatures, which over the decades have acquired a fearsome reputation. Finally, this evening, a Brazilian billionaire who has converted a vast outdoor park of tropical rainforest studded with contemporary artworks into Latin America's largest open-air museum. Now, the park, which employs about 800 employees, exhibits close to 5,000 different plants, as well as the works of 200 international artists. Many visitors have described the park as simply gorgeous. And that's what we're covering on this Friday afternoon here from Caracas. We have plenty more on those stories and others at our website, telesurtv.net/English or Telesur English. I'm Cody Weddle. Today we're going to leave you with more of that animated movie from Mexico we were showing you just earlier. For Telesur English, I'm Cody Weddle. Have a great day.
Estoy emocionada. ¿Ya va a cantar? Estoy orgullosa de ti, hijo.
Ay, ma. Bueno. Ahí va.
¡Ay, qué lindo cantó!
All his life, Toto dreamed of becoming a champion.
Yo algún día voy a ser un gran gallo de pelea.
Tienes que encontrar tu golpe.
No. But when their farm is threatened.
Creo que yo sé cómo ganar ese dinero. Ganando una apuesta en el palenque.
Yo pensé que la teníamos difícil.
He'll have to face the best of the West.
¡Es el banquiboide! Sí pelearé.
¿Es cierto que usted va a salvar el rancho?
Ah, sí.
Yo la quiero mucho. Estoy segura que todo saldrá bien. Ay, puchunguis, huelo a romance.
Ay, y yo a frijoles.
Quiero que pintes toda esa barra. Watson, what's up?
¿Eso me va a enseñar a defenderme?
No, pero si vamos a perder la granja por...